Yes, I was asked to talk about feed, but I know more about husbandry than feed because I'm not an animal nutritionist. So I thought this would be a good changeover. I work for Dawes Laboratories. This particular slide here, I want you to at least study a little bit and pick up on some of the key words here. Animal husbandry pertains to the methods employed by keeping domestic animals in such a way to avoid the effects of disease and to increase performance of the animal, so to maintain a system that's sustainable. You'll hear the word sustainable bat around, but in my opinion, if it's not sustainable, if it's not cost effective, i.e. profitable to the owner. So if you want to talk about sustainability, we have to talk about how to make money. I got to do a little bit of marketing because my boss told me to. So we make these products: Daw Ace, vitamin C and vitamin E, Stress Ease Plus, which is a water-soluble vitamin, and then the Grow Gel Plus, which is one of my favorites, especially with the game bird industry. It comes in a little dry pack. You mix it with water, holds 95% its weight in water, and you put it out for the chicks the first day and they eat that. So that'll come up a little bit later. One of the points I wanted to make, or always like to make, is you can see the dehydration in the birds. If the birds don't eat in the first 24 hours, they're going to die in the first 5 days. And I'll repeat that later, but you can kind of see what's going on here in this dehydration in this photograph. Again, Grow Gel Plus is a water, 95% water is put on top of the feed. The birds pick at it, they eat it. Within a few minutes it's gone, and now they know where the feed is at. So again, that's my pitch for the day, and you could buy it at your local QC supply. Okay, now into my talk. What I want to discuss today is we talk a lot about flock and flock performance and preparation for the flock, but I want to think about the individual itself. You've got hundreds or thousands of birds going down in one day, but each individual certain things have to happen for that bird to successfully make it through the first week. And the three things that must happen is it must get a drink of water, it must eat food, and we must regulate its temperature in order for it to survive. Before it eats and drinks, it doesn't have the metabolism to create its own body temperature, so we have to regulate the temperature. So that's very important. Of course, in order to have a successful brooding situation, you have to be prepared. And so I use this photo, and it always looks better on the screen than it does up here, but there's a lot of things I want you to notice here. We got a stove, we've got a ring, and the video from France did a very good job of showing you that setup here, but preparation is the key here. I'm going to get familiar with my buttons here because I'm going to go back and forth between these two slides quite a bit. These are actually the same birds, about 15 minutes apart. And so we walked into the building and we see these birds, and they're all gathered here around the stove, and they're all trying to stay warm, and something's not going well. And the problem is that these little birds right here in the middle, although they might be comfortably warm, they're not eating and drinking. Now these birds have, since I know the grow gel goes down in the first hour, these birds have only been in here 20, 30 minutes or an hour or something like that. But they're not eating and they're not drinking water. So we made an adjustment in the ventilation of the building. We also changed the light and came back 20 minutes later, and sure enough, the birds had scattered out. And so they may have been chilled, or there may have been a draft on their back or something like that, but something was causing these birds to not do what we wanted them to do, which was to scatter out and begin finding food and water. And if they don't find food and water in the first few hours, they get in a critical situation very quickly because they lose weight, they can't maintain their own body temperature. So the most important thing we need to get done is help them find food and water so they can generate their own heat. This is a nice little display. We talk about if we got good heat, we got good distribution. If the birds are a little chilled, they might be piled towards the heat. If they're too hot, they might be moving away. But again, if they're moving one direction or another, you got to look for a draft. Because we call it draft shield, that ring we put around, and it's very important. If they get any draft on their back at all, they'll be reacting to the draft, and what we want them to do is find food and water. Here's some 3-day-old birds you can see, and again, I wish these photos would show up better, but what we see is we get a good distribution of birds all through so there's no, there we go, thank you. So we get a good distribution of birds, everyone's eating and drinking and doing well. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is medication systems here, because it came up at least once today. We talked about worming or using vitamins and electrolytes and heat. So one of the things we want to look at is some way to get medication into your system. Harlan talked about putting in disinfectants. We've got a dosatron or other medicator pump. So I don't know. Every once in a while I'll get a call from somebody and they'll say, what can I do? And I say, well, we need to worm or we need to medicate. I don't have any way of doing that. It's difficult with pheasants, but it is a good plan to try to come up with some kind of medication system for your birds and see if there's a way to get. And this system right here is basically a 55-gallon barrel next to a trough drinker, so the medication can be put into that barrel and then given to the birds that way. So again, a part of your planning, your strategic planning for your facility is to have some way to medicate the birds. Sometimes when I visit folks, I'll spend 3 or 4 hours with them talking about the things that I'm talking about here in about 20 minutes. So as we're moving through a lot of this stuff, it's mainly to create the opportunity for you to think about it. But one of the things that come up a lot in my visits is we don't have what I call minimum ventilation in our brooder houses. And minimum ventilation is just the ventilation necessary to remove the waste products, whether it be the carbon dioxide or the water. And I want to concentrate on water because if you do a good job of ventilating to remove water, the oxygen will take care of itself. I'm not talking about temperature control. I'm talking about ventilation, minimum ventilation for removal of, to bring in oxygen and to control relative humidity. The important thing is on your minimum ventilation is you cannot do it with a thermostat. You have to have a timer. I like this timer here, although it's not on the market anymore. We called it a 10-minute timer. Basically, it had an off and an on, and it ran around. Took 10 minutes to run around. So if you set it on 1 or 2, the fan ran for 2 minutes, off for 8. On for 2, off for 8. Some of the newer ones, this is a 30-minute timer that you can set the on time and the off time. But it's 30 minutes, so you got a 30-minute rotation. So I never did find a good example to show you today because this one here, this one had a 20-minute, but you could turn it down to 1 minute. I think you could adjust these so it'd be on for 2 and off for 5 or something like that. But that's what you need in order to get the oxygen into the building and the moisture out of the building. So that's what we need for minimum ventilation. Again, this is basically for the printout, something that you could go back and read later as far as discussing the on-time, off-time. We like 5-minute cycles or 10-minute cycles. Anything more than a 10-minute cycle, your air deteriorates too much before the fan comes on, or the fan runs too long before it might start cooling the building. This purpose is not to cool the building, it's only to take moisture out of the building. So that's a very important part of this. And then I wanted to add this little equation here because what our idea is to exchange the air in the room, and we have a room here. So we would want to set up the ventilation in this room for us to exchange the air about every 8 minutes. That seems to work very well in our poultry setups. So what you do is you take your building. If you have a 50 by 40 foot building, and it's got a 10-foot ceiling. That's 20,000 cubic feet. So we divide that by 8. That way we can exchange the air in 8 minutes. That's 2,500 CFMs. So then what we do is we go out and we find a fan that can do that. That can change the air every 8 minutes. And these things are kind of rough, so you just kind of go down here and you pick a fan. Okay, I think I need a 14-inch fan or a 16-inch fan to do the job. So you want to install a 16-inch fan on your 50 by 40 building and then set it up on a timer so that it runs 2 minutes out of every 8. And then when the birds get a little older, you might run 3 minutes out of 10, or 3 on, 7 off. Why do we do this? Because, and I'm going to use a chicken model here that I picked up found some information on. At 70 degrees, a bird will consume about twice as much water as it does feed. So if they eat 100 pounds of feed, you've got 200 pounds of water going into your building. And they expel, some of that water stays in the bird for growth, but a lot of it gets expelled either through their breathing or manure. So this particular model, my chicken model here, he has 103 degree temperature. That chicken can produce 45 BTUs per hour. So that heat also has to be produced. Now again, going back earlier, I was talking about regulating temperatures. This is once the bird's metabolizing feed and water, it's producing heat. So basically, once you get the bird through the first 5 days, you're keeping the bird cool because the bird has to expel all this heat. So using our chicken model here, 20,000 4-pound chickens can produce about 400,000 BTUs per hour, or about 1,000 gallons of water a day. I said, well, you guys don't have that much. So let's equate it back. So 6,400 birds that weigh 2 ounces, that's 800 pounds a bird. So they're producing 100 gallons of water a waste a day. So that's what I want you to remember. If you have 6,000 birds, 6,500 birds in a pen, you're dumping about 100 gallons of water on the floor every day. Now, if you went in there with a 5-gallon bucket and you started pouring water out, you'd realize what was going on. But since you're doing it through the bird, you're not thinking about it. And where's that 100 gallons of water have to go? It doesn't run out the door. It has to go through the fan blade. So it has to be picked up off the floor, dried out, and then taken out through the fan blade. And so that's what we have to do. So how do we do that? Well, we bring air from the outside. In my model here, I got 60-degree air coming in, but it's raining. So that 60-degree air has a maximum holding capacity of 16 gallons. I warmed the air up to 80 degrees, and it doubles that. So now I can hold 30 gallons of water. So I can reduce the humidity in the building by bringing in 60-degree air, warming it up to 80 degrees, and then taking it out of the building. So even on a rainy day, you can dry a building by warming the air. If you can only warm the air 10 degrees, you have to ventilate. You have to increase the amount of air you're bringing into the building. But that's the general rule: is you bring cool air into the building, warm it up, stir it around, and then it'll pick up moisture, and then you pump it back out. And that's how you pump water out of a building. And that's why you need minimum ventilation. So again, going back to this point here, the minimum ventilation is just the ventilation necessary to take the water out of the room. Again, if I use enough ventilation to get the water out of the room, I'll get plenty of oxygen. So I'm not worried about oxygen. You use a timer to do that. You run about, have your air turn over about every 8 minutes, pick the right fan, and keep your building nice and dry. The next thing I like to talk about is, and again, when I meet with my clients, I talk about horizontal ventilation a lot. If I have a fan up here in the corner running, and it's pumping out my air every 8 minutes, and it's doing a good job, the guy back in the back room there, not necessarily is all the moisture going to get picked up in the back of the room and carried all the way to the front of the room. So what I like to do is stir the air up in the room. So at a room like this, I'd like to hang maybe 2 or 3 fans, and I want to point them all in one direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push all the air to one end of the room. What the air is going to do is hit the wall, and it's going to run down the sidewall. And I've many times you hang strings on the side of the wall. Even though you're pushing the air that way, it'll run down the wall. It comes back, it runs back and forth. And what this does, and you only have to run this like a minute. As soon as the air gets moving through the whole room, you turn those fans off. So you run them maybe 3 minutes out of every 15, or maybe only about 30 or 40 seconds. If you have 4 fans, you'd only have to run 30 or 40 seconds. As soon as the air starts moving through the room, you're done. And what that does is it homogenizes the temperature throughout the whole room. Right now in this room, it's warmer up front because we're up front. It's cooler in the back. But if we were horizontally ventilating, we'd have equal temperature throughout the whole room. Picks up the moisture in the back of the room. That way when the fan kicks on up here, way up in the corner, it's pumping out the same amount of water as it would be if it was, in other words, it's picking up water all the time. Now I have some people that say, well, I'm going to do some fans down this side and some fans down the other, but it takes twice as many fans to do it, and there's a little conflict here. So I like to use this slide when I'm talking to my big turkey guys with their 500-foot buildings, and I say, well, you don't need that many fans, and you'll get a lot better efficiency if you just put your fans right down the middle instead of down the side. And even in a little brooder house, I like to come in with just one little fan, set it up on a timer, and just stir the air around. Again, you don't want to create a draft on your bird. That's a different story. But once you get that, if you can get that air moving around and pick up the moisture off the floor, then when your minimum ventilation fan kicks in, you won't have to run it as long because its job is just to pump the water out of the building, not to stir the air. So I've got 2 different systems, horizontal ventilation and minimum ventilation. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about and what I'm going to show you are what I call they're mortality charts from a turkey farm. They're from 2 or 3 different turkey farms. I'll get calls occasionally, and someone will say I'm losing too many birds, and that's a serious, critical issue that we have to figure out immediately. But one of the things I like, usually with birds that are dying today, is because of something that happened a week ago. And so what I want to do is go back and look at what was going on a week ago and try to figure out why the birds are dying today. And this mortality chart can actually do a very good job of doing that. So what I'm doing here is I see, okay, we lose 341 the first, and again, this is, let's see, how many birds are we talking? 38,000 birds, so don't get alarmed by these numbers here. You got 340 and then 130 and 110, and you got 1,700. Well, something obviously went wrong right here, but it actually started happening back in here. Look here, we had 6, 14, 48, 37, 78. So the birds were actually sick back in here. So if we would have, instead of waiting till this point that we had the problem, when I see birds in mortality doubling every day, that tells me something's going on and I need to look at. And if I wanted to go and discover the problem, there was probably, and in fact I know what was going on here, there was a ventilation issue and the birds were crowded and ammonia started to build up and things like that. So where the problem started was actually up in here. Mortality charts are a good thing to write things down to try to remember, like vaccines, things like that. Again, this is a better scenario here, but again, we've got 3-day mortality. These birds were dying when they came to the farm, so there was something maybe in the transportation that was causing a problem, but they did a good job, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They did a good job of getting them on feed and water. We didn't have a high starve out here, so although the birds came in with a problem, they alleviated the problem very quickly. The fact that they cut it down tremendously over the next 2 or 3 weeks tells me that I got a good management scenario here. So I'm very, very good with, this thing's very well managed flock. Again, this is a good way also to chart other events like vaccinations, movements, culling, different things like that. Again, there's information. I can look back, again, this was 2 or 3 years ago. I can look back at this and say, okay, well, this is, things are going quite well here. We have a little trouble at the beginning. These birds, there was a little bit of a starve out, so we didn't quite get them on feed and water. Maybe they came in chilled. Maybe the light was not bright enough or something like that. And again, sometimes you don't want to, some of these details you don't want to remember, like pileups. But you can go back in and say, well, what happened here? Well, we had some piling and different things like that. So they're just a great way. I like to keep records, and we can go back and analyze them and kind of see where you're at. And again, when you're looking for problems, we're not looking right here. The problems, we can't fix it now. We can use medications to maybe stop it from getting worse. But what we do, when I go in, we see problems like this, we go back a week or 10 days before that, try to find out what the management situation was that caused it. That's all, unless there's any questions.